Hello all and welcome to CFA's third virtual equity conference, Co-Conspiring for an Equitable Future, Building the Social Justice Bridge. My name is Alexa Sardina. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white woman in her 40s and I'm a professor in the Division of Criminal Justice at CSU Sacramento. Today, I have the pleasure of moderating this session titled No More Police, a Case for Abolition with activist, agitator, organizer, lawyer, and author, Andrea Ritchie. This session will center on the ways in which we imagine and envision a future without police and discuss strategies for co-liberation. Before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to read our land acknowledgement, ground us in, and remind us of our interruption practice statement. We want to acknowledge that we gather as the California Faculty Association on the traditional lands of the indigenous people past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This calls us to commit to continuing to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit as well. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on the land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current, ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. Acknowledging the land is an important Indigenous protocol that we are honoring here today. So I know many of us have been moving from meeting to meeting or task to task, and sometimes our minds race right alongside of us. So I'd like to take a few moments to get us grounded in before switching gears. So I invite you to take a deep, full breath in and a long, slow exhale. You can allow your eyes to gently close or have a soft gaze. Take another nice, big breath in and long, slow exhale, so that you can begin to feel your body release any tightness or tension. Take one more deep, long inhale, and on the exhale, allow yourself to fully arrive into your body, into this moment, and into this breath. Let go of any control of the breath and simply allow yourself to be here. Let go of all of the effort it has taken to bring you here now. Let go of all of the thoughts and pressures of what is yet to come, and give yourself the gift of this moment and this time together. Slowly open your eyes and rejoin the group. So hopefully that has us feeling refreshed and invigorated. And as we move into this conversation with open minds and hearts, it's important that we are mindful of our interruption practice. As part of our continuing commitment to racial justice work, when we experience examples of racial narratives, racism, or whiteness in our meetings, or as we conduct our business, we will speak up. This means we can interrupt the meeting and draw the issue to one another's attention. We will do this kindly, with care, and in good faith. Further, as we engage interruptions, we will take an intersectional approach, reflecting the fact that white supremacy and racism operate in tandem with interlocking systems of oppression, of colonialism, class, cis heteropatriarchy, and ableism. This statement is a reminder that we commit to do this in service of ending the system of racial oppression.
Thank you, Alexa. My name is Andrea Redmond. I'm CFA's Director of Programs for our Anti-Racism and Social Justice work. I am a brown-skinned woman with the color of coffee with a little sugar and a little cream. I'm wearing my glasses today, and I have on a necklace made of seeds, which I got in a compound town in Jamaica. And the centerpiece is shaped like a heart. So very happy to be here with y'all today. and to let you know of our helpful information tidbits. So Kiki is dropping into the chat a link to a landing page for the Equity Conference that has all sorts of good information for you, including information about how you receive a meal reimbursement for the conference here today, as well as links to our book vendor, which is Reparations Club, which is a woman-owned and Black-owned, very cool bookstore outlet. And there's a 10% discount. So that information is also in the chat. Will be dropped, is part of the Zoom link. It just dropped in the chat. Sorry, y'all. There's Zoom backgrounds on the landing page. There's, if you want to use some of the backgrounds you see us using, as well, there is information about continuing education units that we are offering as part of this equity conference. That is a member benefit. Once you have attended the workshop offerings and have done the work to register with the CEU, it is CFA will reimburse the cost to you for those CEU units. So please do check out the landing page, take advantage of all the things that are there, and enjoy this next session with Andrea Ritchie.
Thanks, Audrina. So now I'm going to give a more comprehensive introduction to our guest today. So Andrea Ritchie is a lawyer and organizer who has worked on policing and criminalization issues for over 30 years. She's the author of several books, including most recently, No More Police, A Case for Abolition, co-authored with Miriam Kaba. Andrea co-founded the Interrupting Criminalization Initiative, as well as the In Our Names Network, which is a network of over 20 organizations working to end police violence against Black women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people. An expert on policing issues, Andrea has authored many research reports, articles, and opinion pieces on policing, criminalization, mass incarceration, and immigration enforcement. And these are just a few of her many accomplishments. Andrea's work demands that we imagine a future without police and calls on all of us to examine and interrogate what safety and justice look like for everyone. So please give a very warm virtual welcome to Andrea Ritchie.
Thank you so much to Audrina and Alexa and Kiara and everyone else who has been part of organizing this conference and apparently showing you my screen. Okay, and this space and inviting me to be part of it. And I'm just deeply honored to be here today. I am a very light-skinned Black woman with curly hair. I'm wearing glasses today. And I am also wearing a necklace along with a green shirt. And it's actually my mother's, who was born across the island from a kapong in Jamaica. In addition to the things that you heard in my introduction, I'm a Black woman, I'm a lesbian, I'm an immigrant, and I'm a survivor of state and interpersonal violence. And I share those things because they're not necessarily apparent from looking at me, and also because they, and primarily because they've deeply shaped the work that Alexa described over the last 30 years. I'm coming to you now from the occupied territories of the Tongva and Gabrielino peoples, and I wanted to add that specific acknowledgement of the land on which I sit at this moment. I have been a long time union member and part of the labor movement. In fact, I was fired from one of my first jobs at Greenpeace for organizing a union, served as a shop steward in my subsequent work, and have organized for workers, or been advocate for people around workers' compensation and around green jobs, and in law school even interned at the AFL-CIO. So in that way, I wanted to wish you all a happy International Women's Day and celebration of women, queer, and trans people's leadership in labor movements. So I wanted to begin today's conversation as we begin the book. And obviously the chat is not, because we're in a webinar, we're not, well, actually you could just, yeah, think to yourself and maybe write down your answer to this question. When was the first time you questioned the violence of policing? And we start with that question because often it's a spectacular moment, like for instance, for many people, the on-camera murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin in the summer of 2020. And for many of us, it's generational. So it might have been Mike Brown in 2014. It might have been Amadou Diallo in 1999. It might have been the beating of Rodney King, which is where I came in to the scene. And while I was aware of sort of the daily violence of policing, seeing it represented in that way for many of us was a moment of recognizing that this was a systemic issue and not something that was exceptional. And I listed, you'll notice the names I listed there are the names of people who are assigned male at birth, are presumed to be cisgender, are assumed to be heterosexual, and that is the lens through which many people understand the violence of policing. And as you heard in my work, I have focused on and explored these issues through the lens of the experiences of primarily Black women, queer and trans people, as well as women and queer and trans people of color. And when we look at policing through that lens, we see not only the same kinds and forms of policing that we know Black men to experience. So for instance, for each of those names I mentioned, I could mention the name of a woman or a queer or trans person who was harmed or killed the same year. I could say Taisha Miller's name. I could say LaTanya Haggerty's name. I could say Michelle Cousseau's name, who was killed by Phoenix police several days after Mike Brown. I could certainly say Sandra Bland or Breonna Taylor, names that people are more familiar with now. But, and then if we looked at, for instance, police beatings, there are certainly many of those that we could point to. And we would also see, if we looked at statistics around racial profiling in traffic and police stops, we would see the same rates of racial disparities among men as we would among women, the similar forms of violence that take place in the context of those stops. And then we would also see other forms of the violence of policing. We would see things like sexual violence by police. We would see policing of pregnancy and parenthood. We would see policing that takes the form of profiling Black women, Indigenous women, women, queer and trans people of color as being involved in the sex trades during those street stops and those traffic stops. We would see the kinds of policing of trans and gender non-conforming people that is going to only become more amplified under the current attacks across the country, legislatively policing where trans people can use restrooms, where they can use segregated facilities, including in educational institutions, what kind of healthcare they can access, what kinds of ways parents can raise trans children, et cetera. So by looking at policing and understanding the violence of policing through the lens of those experiences, I've been able to quickly see how rapidly it has spread throughout almost every aspect of society over the past several centuries, and the many forms that it takes that are not only about policing the lines of race, but also those of gender, sexuality, nation, and class. So when you're thinking about when you first question the violence of policing, think about whether it was a particular incident. For many of us, it was when we witnessed or experienced policing ourselves or with someone that we loved. Or for many of us, it's also when we called for police assistance or help or sought protection in some way and didn't get it, or worse yet, when the police came, they came for us. And so There are many points of entry into this conversation. I wanted to just acknowledge as many as I could. The other way that we invited people into the conversation about No More Police, the book, was by releasing a series of posters that were framed around the question of how would you describe police or policing in one sentence? So inviting you to think about that. If you had to describe police or policing in one sentence, how would you do that? Let me jot that down. We can share some of those maybe later in the Q&A. We invited folks, some of whom you may be familiar with, some scholars and organizers who have inspired us over the years, or who have described what police and policing are quite concisely. So for instance, Alexandra Goodwin is an organizer in Chicago who describes police as the muscle of racial capitalism. Nicole Siegel describes police as the realization of state violence in human form. Mariam Kaba describes police as defending the system that generates crime, etc. And so what we wanted to do with this exercise is to really help people understand that police and policing as we see it are what police and policing is, or as systems research shows, you know, a system is what a system does, and to really help people understand the fundamental nature of policing. And so we hoped, and this is for educators out there, that folks would use these to also generate conversation and discourse in your classrooms around what people understand police and policing to be. So you can download these posters from our website at interruptingcriminalization.com, and then have a classroom conversation about, you know, policing being not the absence of law, but the essence of law in a system of racial capitalism, as Naomi Murakawa says, or that state governance requires policing in all its forms to maintain expansive indigenous dispossession, or this question of whether procedural reform expands police power. So those were the two ways that we invited people into the conversation around No More Police. We also invited them into a history of the demands that people saw emerging more broadly. They did not emerge for the first time in 2020 by far, but that became sort of a clarion call across the country and across the continent and even around the world to defund the police. And so for many people, that was an entry point into this conversation about a world that has no more police, or police abolition. And that addresses the violence of policing by recognizing what police are, and therefore deciding that the way to eliminate the violence of policing is to eliminate the violence of police. And I wanted to particularly lift up the first section, the historical section of No More Police. It's reproduced in this newspaper that's put out by Critical Resistance called The Abolitionist, that you can find online in the summer 2021 issue. But I wanted to raise it because so much of the history of this demand comes from right here in California. And in also what you all have framed in your work or described as equity interrupted. In other words, divestment from public institutions as they became more integrated, as barriers to access for Black people, migrants, Indigenous people, disabled people, people who are deemed unworthy in systems of racial capitalism, was as access to public institutions increased for those populations, investment in those public institutions, universities, libraries, other public goods decreased, and investment in criminalization increased. And so the demand to defund police certainly, for instance, could be traced to the Black Panthers, who demanded an end to police brutality and murder of Black people, and demanded land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. That is a demand to defund the police and fund the things that will produce greater safety and well-being in communities. And that demand also came from struggles here in California We cite a 1995 article in The Nation by Mike Davis, may he rest in power, who really exposed kind of the trajectory of the exploding prison population and the ways in which that, of course, they would take the garbage out at this point. Okay, and the ways in which the explosion of the prison population in California in the 90s was immediately part of, and that explosion obviously is documented in greater detail in the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore and in Golden Gulag and beyond. But really sort of talking about how the explosion of the prison population through three strikes laws and prison construction booms came at the cost of the higher education budget, that literally the state had to loot the higher education budget in order to fund the prison expansion and the expansion of the prison industrial complex. And that's not just me saying that. The Rand Institute, which is, as we all know, not politically aligned, or at least I know is completely not politically aligned with anything I stand for, said in the mid-90s, total education spending will have to fall by at least 40% over a period of almost a decade in order to fund prison construction and expansion in California. And that is in fact what happened, to the point whereby in 2002, the state is spending more money on prisons than college. And so that literal attack on public institutions of education, the defunding of public education to fund police and prisons, contributed to the founding of Critical Resistance, who published The Abolitionist in 1998. We're about to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the founding of Critical Resistance in the Bay Area in May, but also sparked the founding of CURB, Californians United for Responsible Budget, and the No New Jails campaign in LA, and led people to organize in LA to defeat a sales tax that would have funded hiring 1,000 more cops in 2004. So that is a defund campaign, literally defund, decrease funding to institutions that are violent, through defeating the sales tax in 2004 that was happening in LA. And so building on this work and 2 decades of abolitionist organizing, in No More Police, A Case for Abolition, Mariam Kaba and I make this simple case, which is that police don't promote safety, they get in the way of it, that the violence of policing cannot be reformed because, as all of those posters pointed out, police are violent. They are doing exactly what they were set up to do, which is to manufacture the order that makes racial capitalism possible. And we can create, and people are creating and building, greater safety and well-being without police. So it's a simple case, but it takes us 400 pages to make it. And we cite a great deal of research, and I'll share some of that as we go along. But what we really also wanted to point out that, many people entered this conversation about defunding and police abolition in 2020 through sort of budget campaigns, People's Budget LA, defund Oakland. People really started thinking about, how do we take money out of institutions like the ones that killed George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and put them into the things that we need to survive the triple pandemic of, COVID-19, climate collapse, economic crisis, other pandemics of white supremacy, the ongoing pandemic of anti-Black racism and colonialism. How do we take money out of the institutions of violence and put them into the things that we need as a community? But what we really wanted to also make clear in No More Police, that means not just moving some money from one line item over to the other, or just shrinking the footprint of the police, or closing some prisons or jails, but that what that means is the entire remaking of society, that police currently manufacture the order that makes this society possible, and therefore we need to manufacture a wholly different social order and remake the world and the ways that we relate to each other and that we meet individual and collective needs. And so that's what a world of no more police means to us and to many abolitionists. And so taking the first element of the case, that cops don't stop violence, we cite to abundant research, and I hope that you get a chance to look at it. Much of the research we cite too is by law enforcement themselves. They know that increased numbers of cops don't stop violence, faster response time doesn't stop violence, more diversity in the police force doesn't stop violence, different strategies of policing don't stop violence. And that's simply because cops don't prevent violence. And they don't even interrupt violence, because most of the time they arrive after the fact. And most of the time people call someone else before they call the cops when they're in trouble, because they know someone else will get there faster. They don't transform the conditions that make violence possible. In fact, they contribute to them by taking resources away from things like education, housing, healthcare, public space, libraries, etc. And in fact, it's not their purpose to stop violence, because as we showed earlier, their purpose is to create and maintain a particular order. So we know that, police research shows that. And even if you can find one study that shows that increased police presence might temporarily make a blip on the statistics that they create and measure, because remember, crime statistics are created by police and can be manipulated by police and have been often manipulated by police, including, for instance, the LAPD. But even if you found one study that they managed to show that they do have an impact on violence, we also know that we can have an impact on violence using other means. And often, as Rachel Hertzing, a member of Critical Resistance, points out, we're presented with the issue as police or no police. There's just a tap you turn on and you turn off. And there's no other options. And we cite research in the book that shows, for instance, that for us, every 10 new nonprofits, there's in a city, there's a decrease in the rate of homicides or violent crime. And so even if police did address violence, there are better ways of doing it that don't come with the violence of policing and that actually meet people's needs in community. So we use this research to make the case that, police failure to stop, interrupt, or transform violence is no accident. Police have never been about preventing violence. They've always been about fabricating and maintaining a particular order using violence to contain and control racialized and gendered populations of people in service of a particular capitalist order. So that's the first element of our case. And as part of that case, we really want to emphasize, and this is why I said this at the beginning, that we are survivors of violence, that movements to defund and abolish police are led by survivors, like myself, like Mariam Kaba, like so many others who we cite in the book, who want actually more safety for ourselves and our communities, and are constantly thinking about what the best way what the best way forward is to achieving safety. And we are guided by the fact that for many of us, police did not provide safety. And for some of us, police created more unsafety by perpetrating violence. And that for 75% of sexual assault survivors who never call the police, that all the money we're throwing at police is not doing anything for them. We're also mindful of the fact that almost half of survivors of domestic violence never call the police. And therefore, all the money we're investing and all the ways in which we're trying to make policing, quote unquote, better doesn't do anything for them. And they have many good reasons. There are recent studies of callers to domestic violence hotlines who say why they don't call the cops, because they're afraid that the cops will be violent to them, that they're afraid that it will involve the family police and increase the chances of family separation, that they're afraid of immigration consequences, they're afraid of being kicked out of their housing, and they're afraid of violence against the person who might be harming them, because what they want is a cessation of the violence. They don't want an increase of the violence, and they don't necessarily want to be separated from that person. They want that person to be transformed, and none of those things happen through policing. So it's keeping that reality in mind that we're calling for something better, for investment in the things that survivors have always said that they needed, and that is housing, healthcare, income, employment, childcare, immigration status, the things that give survivors autonomy and the ability to self-determine and to leave violent situations when they occur, to interrupt it when it's happening, to be empowered to make decisions based on our well-being. And so there's a lot more information in that chapter, but just to the extent that the first response often when we say, you know, we're calling for a world without police is, well, what about the people who are engaged in gender-based violence or domestic violence or sexual violence? And the answer is, yes, what about them? The current system is not reducing that kind of violence. It's in fact perpetrating it. And we want something better. And I often quote my colleague, Erin Miles Cloud of Movement for Family Power, who says, everybody cares about someone's safety somewhere, some of the time. Abolitionists care about everybody's safety everywhere, all of the time. And we think it's an incredible indictment on the system that the vast majority of survivors of the kinds of violence that the system claims to prevent or protect us from won't engage the system and aren't protected by it because it is a system of violence. So, but can't we fix it? Can't we fix it? So there's a whole chapter to the point of reform will not reduce the violence of policing, and instead it will legitimize it, it will perpetrate it, it will put more resources towards it, and continue to perpetrate the same results that we're seeing, which is in a country that spends over $130 billion a year on policing, no reduction in violence, and in fact, increasing rates of violence, and including the violence of policing. And Mariam really insisted that we spell reform in this way, because it means that when we're trying to tweak or fix systems of policing, we're just reshaping them into new forms that don't actually address the underlying root causes of the violence, which is the violence that is policing. Now, that doesn't mean that we go from 0 to 1,000, that we go from, you know, a society entirely shaped by and permeated by police to one in which police don't exist. That's just not possible to do overnight. We need to be doing that through, you know, steps that take us closer to that. And so we can make transformative demands. Defund the police is a good example of a transformative demand that center people and don't presume that cops will always exist and we just have to keep trying to make them better when in fact they're doing exactly what they were set out to do. They're demands that hasten the end of the systems of violence and harm and promote and make conditions possible for new systems of increased safety and well-being to emerge. And they reflect the society that we want to build. So I don't want a society where cops continue to engage in the violence that killed Tyree Nichols, but now it's on camera so we can all watch it. I want a world where Tyree Nichols is still skateboarding into the sunset and then coming home to his son and his mom and living his life. And so that's the society I want to build, and that we, when we're thinking about what reforms we want to pursue, will they actually get us to that world? So one obviously is getting cops off campus that you all are working on, and we'll talk more about that later. But if you're looking for kind of an overall guidance on like what kinds of demands can be transformative us and bring us closer to a world of greater safety and well-being, and which ones just keep us kind of circling the drain of the current world and reproducing police in new form, we created a binder of charts and graphs and checklists and Capricorns. I really love those things, you know, where you can just go through and be like, oh, no, that's not do that. Oh, yes, that's going to help. And so folks at Critical Resistance have created a number of these charts, and others have too, and they're gathered in that binder, including this one that focuses on getting cops off campus. So it points to some reforms that take us further down the road of legitimizing and supporting policing, and to get us caught in institutional efforts to preserve policing in different forms, and others that actually get us closer to educational settings that are free from the violence of policing in all the forms it takes. And so, for instance, and the questions that it invites us to think about when we're deciding which of those reforms to pursue in the context of getting cops off campus is, does it reduce funding to police? Does it increase well-being for students, educators, staff, and community? Does it create possibilities for radical teaching and learning? And does it address historical contemporary forms of policing and military presence on campus? So when you're moving forward your campaign to get cops off campus, thinking about the different strategies and which of those, what the answers are to those questions. So this chart should help you with that. We also have a chapter in the book called No Soft Police, because we really wanted to make sure that we don't replace policing with, or police with policing in a different form. So we don't want campus security who just wear different uniforms but do the same thing. We don't want private security that are in different uniforms but doing the same thing. We don't want staff and faculty and administration to step into the role of police if we get cops off campus and do the same things. So we talk in No Soft Police about the kinds of campaigns that we've seen over the last 20 years where we say things like treatment, not punishment, but there's no treatment when it's coerced. When there's mandatory, mandated, coercive medical intervention, that's not treatment. That is another form of policing and punishment. We hear things like counselors, not cops, but if the counselor is aimed at getting you to comply in the same way that police are with a particular set of mandates and norms, then they're not counseling you into being and becoming, achieving your highest human potential, which is the hope that counseling would be. They're counseling you in a way that is a form of policing. And, Mimi Kim, who teaches at Long Beach, talks a lot about carceral forms of social work, for instance, and is one of the founders of the National Association for Abolitionist Social Work. So there's people who are thinking through how to do the work of counseling or casework or social work in ways that don't simply replicate or reproduce cops. And what that requires us is to really not just divest from policing ideologically or financially. It also requires us to divest from policing emotionally. And the notion that we have to, as Mariam says, have someone else to call to take someone who we feel is, criminalized or who's criminalized in some way somewhere else. Like maybe it's not the cops, maybe it's not a jail, but we need someone to come take this person somewhere else. And the question is, or do we need to identify what that person's needs are, whether what they're doing is a problem at all, and if it is it a problem for them, and if it is, then how do we meet the needs that they have that can alleviate those issues? And if it's a collective issue or a problem for the group, then how do we navigate those issues as a group in a way that respects everyone's humanity? So that's what safety is, and it requires all of us to step in, not to police other people or exclude them or just call someone to get rid of them. It also requires us to recognize that safety is not a perfect state of being that can be achieved. And in fact, it's not something the state can sell you, and it's not something that private security can sell you. None of us are fully safe. It's all relative, and it all has to do with our relationship to resources and each other. And so when we're thinking about how we actually get to a world of increased safety and well-being, we have to think about how we build the kinds of skills and relationships and social infrastructures that will enable us to achieve greater safety collectively. And so that obviously requires us to unseat what Augusto Boal calls the cop in our heads, and the propaganda that tells us that without police we'll live in a world that is inherently and violently unsafe, and that we need to accept the violence of policing in order to be sold this carceral notion of safety that we never quite get to. So Mariam talks about it as a protection racket. They keep being like, give us more money and we'll make you safer. Oh, wait, you're still not safe. Give us more money and we'll make you safer. And on and on and on, when in fact, they're just leading us down a road away from the things that actually would make us safer, which is our communities and our resources. The thing I really wanted to emphasize here before closing and opening up to Q&A is some of the tricks and tensions that we identify. And one of them has to do with the relationship of organized labor to police power. And so we talk about how we deal with what people call police unions, but they're in fact, and they call themselves, police fraternal associations, because that's what they are. They're frats, they're gangs, they're very self-interested organizations that are not unions like you all are, acting in service of the interests of working people, in service of your students, in service of education, of liberation. They are fraternal associations that are created to advance cops' interests. And it's not just wages and working conditions, it's securing their interests in obtaining the resources and power to enact violence with impunity. One person put it, no, cops are the only people who are negotiating for the right to kill someone without consequences. That's not a union, that's a frat. And so our goal is to recognize how we break organized police power, and that requires organized labor to break with cops and police prisons and other forms of organization that are not about the well-being of the collective, but in fact about continuing the current social order. So there are many folks who are working at this intersection of labor and abolition. That sign is from the Labor for Black Lives in Seattle, Washington, who kicked the cop frat out of their local labor council. And locally, CURB, the organization I talked about, who was at the founding of, kind of movements to defund and abolish police, currently have a campaign inviting labor to be part of kicking prison unions out of the labor movement and really joining in a fight to end police and prisons. And so invite you to think about that and to join in the Close Prisons in California campaign and check in and support the work of CURB and do that and invite other members of labor into that work as well. We also have at Interrupting Criminalization a Abolition and Labor and Capitalism hotline and office hours, and I'm happy to drop the information for that in the chat when we close, so that folks can, if you have ideas about how your union could be organizing to support this work or other work to divest from policing and invest in greater community well-being, you can call and talk that through with Maurice Weeks, who staffs that line. And the last thing I want to sort of really lift up, which is always also the first thing and why I made sure to introduce myself as I did, that, our vision of a world without policing is very much rooted in Black feminism and in remaking the world through Black feminist abolitionist visions and politics. And so to quote, Black feminist texts, we're seeking a wholesale transformation of conditions that produce violence. We want a revolution. We invite people at the end of the book, we close by asking them how you'll practice your Black feminist abolition dreams today. We offer you a number of resources to do that with. Certainly you can learn a lot about movements and organizations working to defund police at defundpolice.org. If you want to learn about how people are building greater safety and well-being in community, you can check out millionexperiments.com. There's a podcast, there's a website, there's a discussion guide that you can use in your classroom that was just released. There are zines, there's every way you can imagine to learn about how people are building safety without police. We also created a website about courts, because there's something between police and prisons that continues to criminalize and is what feeds people from one into the other. And so we really wanted to attend to this question of how do we investigate, adjudicate, and transform harm, and the fact that courts absolutely do not do that, and how we are intervening to interrupt the violence of courts and then imagine other ways of achieving those goals. And then there's the information about the labor and abolition office hours and fellowship and table that you can join if you would like. There's a discussion guide for No More Police if you want to start using it in your classroom. There are some questions, reflections, actions, research you can take. If you want kind of an update on where movements to defund and abolish police are these days, because politicians and pundits want to declare it dead over and over and over again, which is actually a sign of how vibrant and impactful it is, because if something's not alive, you don't have to keep, something's not actually dead, you don't have to keep declaring it dead. So people keep trying to stifle what is one of the most powerful demands of this generation. And so we wanted to lift up what folks are still doing which includes having conversations. So I just wanted to close because I know all of you are thinking about, well, how do we bring more people into this struggle? How do we have these conversations with our students? And people across the country are using surveys and canvases and participatory research and community-based storytelling projects and really having living room conversations. So there's so many ways that people are engaging people in these conversations about what safety is, what policing is, how we achieve greater safety and well-being and less violence. And the folks in Minneapolis came up with a guide that, again, I can drop a link in the chat later about how to have conversations in your community. So there are many ways that we can be building together towards a world with no more police and all the things we need to ensure maximum safety and well-being for Black women, girls, queer, trans people, and all of us. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for all of that. Everything you said is so important to all of the work that we're doing, especially around getting cops off campus and starting those conversations with folks. So we'll have time now for Q&A. There are already some questions here. So the first question that came in has to do with the word safety and how it's been co-opted into forms of soft policing. So the question is, how can we talk about safety in a way that's more consistent with community care and abolition?
I think that it goes sort of more deeply into the questions or the things that I flagged in the presentation, which is that we have to question the notion of safety itself. I mean, who has perfect safety? We live on a rock that's careening through the universe and could be hit by an asteroid at any, like there could be an earthquake tomorrow. There could be, any number of terrible things could befall us. And, there's, and obviously the way that risk is distributed falls along the axes of race, gender, sexuality, class, nation, etc. And so we need to eliminate the distribution of risk that currently reinforces existing power structures, but we have to recognize that risk is part of human existence. So that's one. We have to stop saying that, we're going to achieve some kind of perfect safety and that we're just going to keep, putting more money into policing until we get there when we're never going to get there. The second thing is we need to, recognize that probably sometimes it's time to give up on certain words and framings, and safety might be one of them. And Mariam believes that it's been completely seized by the other side and asks us to use words like well-being or community needs being met, or I don't know that I'm ready to give up on the word safety, but it definitely has been securitized, right? And so we want to describe what we mean by safety when we say it. And then I think the third thing is we do have to really recognize this question about it being relative and relational, and that how we talk about it is, how do we get closer to it? What do you need to be safe? What do I need to be safe? Where are the real threats in our lives, as opposed to like the ones that we're taught to learn? And then how do we address those directly? Because I think the notion that, King Kong might jump out of the bushes, if I'm organizing my life around that and organizing society around that, then that's going to produce a particular kind of society. If I'm organizing it around, I will be safer if I'm in a stronger relationship with you, then that's going to be a society where we're trying to figure out how to strengthen those relationships and our skills to respond when we need each other. So I think, and I really think particularly the part about it being co-opted into soft policing, we really have to interrogate ourselves. How do we talk to ourselves? How do we talk to people in our lives and family members? How are we participating in, how do we embody policing in the way that we relate to ourselves, to each other, to students? I've taught as an adjunct and caught myself policing people about, being late to class when they just were coming from their 14th job, or they had no childcare, or being asleep in class and then having a student say, I'm sorry, the reason I was sleeping in class is because since Trump came into office, I can't sleep because I'm undocumented and I'm afraid I'm going to get ripped from the classroom and my parents are going to be deported. And, asking questions and thinking about how our instinct in those situations is to police, when in fact we need to adopt the approach that we want to see in the world in our own interactions. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. It's really, really insightful. And also it kind of reminds me of the notion of justice and what is justice. And justice looks like many different things to many different people, but it also falls into that trap of being very criminal justice system oriented and framed, and looking outside of those systems is sort of part and parcel of what you're talking about as well. So another great question we have is, what do you see as the greatest obstacle to abolition on our public higher ed campuses? And how do you suggest we mobilize against that?
I think it's this notion that there has to be someone to do the things that we currently have police doing, which inevitably has people doing the things that currently have police doing. So I had the privilege of serving as a visiting professor at a Southern California area institution last year, and the resident advisors were really fighting hard to get resources and support to do transformative justice based work in the dorms and in the residences and on the campus, and we're getting cut while campus police were going up. But also there was this notion that like there has to be someone who's going to come break up the party, as opposed to there has to be someone who's going to be in conversation with people about, yes, you know, we definitely want to celebrate, but we want to do it safely. We want to do it in a way that also people can sleep, because they, you know, maybe depending on this scholarship to stay in school. So how can we navigate this all together? So I think the notion that there has to be someone who's going to, you know, do policing things is what we have to challenge. And my friend Robin Maynard plays a game with her 5-year-old, but I invite all of us to play it, which is to everywhere you see a cop, ask yourself, does that need to be there? What function are they performing there? And what else could we imagine there that would perform that function if it's needed, but also question whether that function is needed, and if it would be needed if we got 1,000 miles ahead of the issue, right? Do we need police to respond to people in mental health crisis? No. And also, how do we prevent mental health crises from happening in the first place, and make sure that at the first sign that I'm feeling unwell, I have a plethora of resources to turn to so we never get to the point of crisis. And I think that those are key things.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a very specific question here about related to campus policing. And this person's asking, our campus has an ongoing contract with Sodexo, which I'm assuming is some external organization that's security oriented, that requires we go to them first for events. How can we work to extract our campuses from using companies like these and contractually binding us to them?
So Sodexo is a private corporation that runs private prisons, but also profits from prison labor, even in public prisons. And I fought on my campus at Howard Law to get them out of the cafeteria, to have them not run our cafeteria. And sadly, we were unsuccessful, but many folks on other campuses were. And I think it's using the power that you have, right? So you all have bargaining power, you just flexed it, and got a good result. And so, you know, flexing it and saying like, actually, as a condition of our contract, we don't want this crap. You have to end that contract. You have to change the notion that we have to go to them first, whatever the demand is. You want them to reopen and renegotiate that contract. Use the power that you have as faculty, as students, and collectively together to put pressure on the administration to bust that contract. So I think that's what we're saying about, you know, police unions or prison unions or joining in various fights to get corporations that are profiting off the prison industrial complex out of college campuses requires building power like any other campaign, right? And using it and being willing to use it and being willing to use the power that you all have as a union to make those kinds of demands, to make demands beyond wage and bread butter issues, and make them in the interests of the kind of world that you want to create. And what is beautiful about campuses and educational institutions and schools is that we can practice the world we want on them, right? And it's a space of learning, it's a space of practice already. And so to really push and be like, we want to practice having food that doesn't come tainted with the profit of, police as part of it. So build
Yeah.
power, flex power. You all know how to do it. You're a union.
And we are, pushing back and organizing around alternatives to campus policing and getting cops off campus. And so, being mindful of this piece of it, I think is important. Having these, sort of contracted organizations coming in to do the work of police is something to be aware of. She got a really nice message and question from Molly. She says,
Hi,
"Hi."
Molly. I owe you an email, Molly. I'm finishing this book, and as soon as I'm done with it, I'll email you.
She says, "Hi, Andrea. Thank you for all of your work. Students in my abolition sociology class loved No More Police. Here's my question. We're having conversations in the union about whether to declare our position as abolitionist and face backlash from our own members, or whether to stick to the language of alternatives to policing. Given what you shared about the trickiness of language being co-opted and distorted, what advice do you have on this? Should we declare our union's position as abolitionist outright if we decide they are, or use the more vague but perhaps more stealth term of alternatives to policing as we build popular support for these ideas? How does language matter in movement strategy to dismantle, defund, and abolish all forms of policing?"
Language matters a great deal, and not, in a way that is wholly rigid. So Mariam would say, and very early in the kind of 2020 period said, we have to stop saying alternatives to policing, because one, it fixes police at the center of your imagination. You're starting from the place of police, then you're like, how can we police in different ways? How can we make different people do it? Maybe in a kinder, gentler way, but we're still thinking about policing. So in that sense, language matters a great deal. And what we've started saying is things like community-based safety strategies, or meeting material needs, or increasing community wellness or well-being as a way of talking about what we mean. I think the same is true for defund and abolish. I mean, the power of those demands is that we're saying what we mean. Take money away from stuff that's violent, put it in stuff that increases community well-being. And organizing requires being able to meet people where they're at and build with them. So I do think that there's a way of describing what you mean. We want to divest from things that perpetrate violence on our campuses and invest in things that increase well-being on our campuses. Basically means you're abolitionist, but is that a better way to, only you can decide based on who you're talking to, what your audience is. I mean, a great deal has been made about polls and who supports defund and whatever. None of us are organizing based on polls. We're organizing based on our vision for the future. And we cite research in the book that most people do, if you say defund the police, the kind of propaganda campaign around it might be that for certain populations, the response might be like, no, we don't support that. It's higher support among the populations who are most affected by violence of policing. But if you actually say what you want to do in concrete terms and demands, support overwhelmingly goes towards those concrete proposals and demands. Do we want to spend more money on cops, or do we want to spend more money on after-school programs? Do we want to spend more money on getting young people engaged in their communities and making sure they get the education that they need and deserve, or do we want to police them out of schools? More money on education. I mean, for the most part, that's how most people respond. And so I think, Molly, the advice is, your members best, but say what you want. Don't try and, make it sound like policing, make it sound like policing, but different. Say what you want. But if there's a way to say that is more likely to be heard or is more specific to your environment, do we want more supports for students who it's XYZ instead of, or do we want a more transformative approach to this rather than that? I think the more specific, the more people can grab onto it. And then they might realize, wake up one day and be like, oh, wait, I'm an abolitionist. So that's the hope.
Absolutely. I think that's a lot of the conversations we've had is around how much money is going to, campus police budgets versus counselors versus, there's a lot of students that don't have enough to eat. Like, we're not putting the resources to those very basic things that are necessary, and putting them towards more and more policing efforts on campus. There's a great question here, and I was going to sort of ask something similar because I heard you use the phrase propaganda, and I think it's so great. So the question that's in the chat is, how can we counter media and film images of policing? Police even use police shows for training, and perhaps how to use this within pedagogy.
Yeah, I mean, if we were in a room together, I would ask everyone who had to read Lord of the Flies as a mandated text growing up to raise their hands. Exactly. Most people in the room would raise their hands. That's propaganda. It's a made up story that somebody, literally William Golding, made up because he read Swiss Family Robinson, which was a true story, or based on a true story, of a family surviving a shipwreck and doing well, and thought to himself, that's not realistic. That's not consistent with the image of the uncivilized world that I've been taught in service of capitalism. And so I'm going to write something that is more consistent with that, and made up Lord of the Flies. And there's actually a true story of some Tongan teenagers who, took a boat out for a joyride, and the good ship, whatever Gilligan was in, I can't remember, Holmes on, things went awry and they were shipwrecked on an island. And for 18 months, they lived in relative harmony. They built a school together. They planted food. They played music. They played games. They took care of each other. They found creative ways of resolving conflict that, had to do with, one, cooling down, and two, recognizing that, so they would have to walk to opposite ends of the island. And by the time they walked back, they had cooled down. They had thought about it, and they had to figure out a way to resolve it because they knew that their survival depended on it. And that story is not mandatory reading everywhere. So the way we counter propaganda is by telling different stories, and by inviting students to tell different stories, by starting off by being like, describe the time you felt the most safe. I've never asked that question and had someone be like, well, when I was surrounded by 15 cops and tanks and an AK-47. Like, and if someone did answer that, I'd be like, why? What about that? What made you feel safer than being, in your home, or surrounded with friends, or, in a park, or enjoying the cherry blossoms, or whatever, right? So I think inviting people to think actually about what makes them feel safe, inviting them to think about the stories they've been told, inviting them to read stories of people caring for each other, creating collective well-being without police, inviting them to think about specific situations where they might be prone to call the cops and then think again, what else might be a source of safety. I think we really have to get into people's imaginations and help people shift their understanding, but also shift their experience, right? So invite people to practice. So when I was teaching last year, my assignments were, you could read a thing, you could listen to a thing if people didn't want to read, or you could practice something. So, practice having a conversation about this with someone, practice, a situation where someone would say that they should call the cops, and practice doing something else, and have it start low key, right? Like, the party next door is noisy, right? Or, and if your experience of going over and asking people to tone down didn't go well, let's talk about why. Let's talk about maybe some racial dynamics. Let's talk about the relationship you have with that person. Let's talk about what their needs were. Let's figure out how the next time it could go better. So just really inviting people to think, experiment, practice something different, and to also really identify propaganda where it is, right? Like, when LAPD says LA is like the plague, what are they basing that on? And what else? And then invite students to research what else might be happening that might be contributing to this. Oh, housing prices are going up. Oh, these programs have been cut. Oh, this issue is not being addressed. People are migrating here and they're not allowed to access any support when they arrive here. You know, what are all the things that might contribute to a condition where people are like, I'm gonna have to take what I need because I'm really hungry, or because I don't have diapers, or I haven't changed my underwear in a week because I don't have any, and so I'm gonna go get some from that store, what my friend calls democratic shopping. So, you know, I think there's we really have to like dig in to help ourselves unlearn what we've been taught, which is that cops are like the thin blue line between us and Blade Runner or The Purge or Generation Z or whatever horrible, because the propaganda isn't just Paw Patrol and Law and Order SVU, it's every film. And then find examples of films and cultural representations and songs and other things that talk about people resolving problems without the cops. And sometimes we don't even see them, but to really lift them up and show them and talk about them with students, I think is the best way I've come up with to do it. And I think that answers your question too, Aparna, about, or I don't actually know if that's how you say your name, so I apologize. But I think that's part of how we convince our community to envision that future with us is really by engaging those conversations everywhere, every day, all the time, and to practice that future together. I don't think we're going to convince a government whose interests are the status quo to get to a police-free future. And I think certainly all sides of the political spectrum have made it clear that they're invested in the current state of affairs. Even when they're passing legislation they say is about police reform, they're actually just pouring more money and legitimacy into the cops. But I do think that doesn't mean that we can't get into situations where we are participating in governance and making different decisions, whether it's participatory budgeting or supporting, you know, LA's comptroller and being like, these numbers are not working, you know, and really getting in there and supporting that, being part of people's budget campaigns, being part of task forces like Defund OPD did. I know folks are organizing in Sacramento and Fresno, in across, you know, the valleys to really get in there on the budget, and then that creates conditions where we can practice and build other things. But I don't think we're going to convince the institutions that require the police to stay in power to give up the police. So we have to fight to create the conditions that make that possible.
I think that's all the questions in here. There is a message. Thank you. Our colonized imaginations around policing and safety need reimagining. We need to reclaim those specific narratives, our counter narratives and language. Thank you.
I think that's true just for all of us. I just really want to name that. You know, I myself have to be in a conversation with myself every day about how we get to policing, how the world I imagine, the world, you know, the detours that we can erroneously go down when we're thinking about what instead. And I think we also have to really think about, I'm sorry, I'm looking for some of the links that I promised you all. Even when we're thinking about how we distribute resources, because there's always a kind of rule and a sort of people who are in and out when you distribute resources. And I think I really want us to think about, I'm just dropping the labor and abolition office hours here. And that's part of the reason that what comes out of No More Police has been a conversation about ultimately what is the role of the state in abolitionist futures. And, you know, is there any way that we can imagine a centralized authority distributing resources in ways that don't involve policing or punishment in some way or another? And so that I think is a question. I'm searching desperately for the discussion guide that we created to help folks grapple with some of these questions. We do not have answers, let me just say that, but I think folks can at least start to grapple with some of these questions. So I think those are all the links I mentioned during my talk, and then I will just do Abolition and the State. And I think that's, oh, here we go, boom. There's a discussion tool that some of you might want to use in your classrooms or with each other as part of your organizing, which is, what do we think a state is? What do we think its role is in our future? And how could, if we do want to create a state that is sort of in the image of the world that we want, how do we imagine it distributing resources, distributing opportunities to heal, distributing risk? In the pandemic, I think there was a really good opportunity for us to think about who had to carry all of the risk, even at the height of protections, and how could we have distributed that risk? Could all of us have had to do a shift at the post office so that all of us could get stuff delivered to us at our home? Could all of us had to have done a shift as a food delivery worker so all of us could have gotten stuff at home? And obviously, doing that in ways that are mindful of disability justice and the things that folks who are disabled absolutely couldn't do, but maybe they could be the dispatch for the this or the, so I think that if they couldn't leave their home because of the ways that they were disabled. So I think really imagining ways to distribute risk and resources and opportunities for healing is an important part of this conversation and reimagining the world. So invite folks to use that discussion tool to think about how to maybe do that.
And I love the discussion tools. I love the checklists. I too am a big fan of those types of infographics, and they are awesome, particularly useful in criminology and critical criminology courses, where a lot of the undoing of beliefs around policing happens for people. So there are no more questions in the chat. So I just want to really thank you for being here with us and, sharing your wonderful work. It gives us a lot to think about, and it's really meaningful, and we appreciate the work you do. So
thank you so much. I really appreciate it. If I might just drop one more thing in the chat that I was trying to do, which is the study guide for the book I wrote before, No More Police, Invisible No More, that looks at experiences of policing through the lens of women, queer and trans people of color's experiences. And there's a study guide there that was written in part with university and college students in mind who are gauging these questions. And you'll see there's sort of timelines of the prison industrial complex that you can print out and use in your classroom. There are exercises that you can do about what criminalization is and how it shapes how people are literally perceived in public spaces, including on campus. There are exercises to imagine different ways of responding to different kinds of violence. There's a whole bunch in there that you can build on as part of this work. So thank you so much for having me. It was such a joy and a privilege to be in this conversation with all of you, and I look forward to continuing it. Please feel free to reach out with any questions or if you want to think through some stuff together.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here.